Welcome everyone to Hunt the Habitat. A great dog and a shotgun will only get you so far in the uplands. In this podcast, Ann Jandernaw helps us to attain a more in-depth understanding of the birds we love to hunt, their habits, their habitat, and how those change through the year and through the hunting season. Hunt the habitat, find the birds. Hi everybody, welcome back to our latest edition of Hunt the Habitat with Ann Jandernaw, brought to you by Scout and Hunt Maps. As always, this is our opportunity to spend time with Ann.
Well, I'm getting questions, and someone will call with a map question. Next thing leads to more questions, which is okay. I mean, that's good. And getting a few questions, I'm trying to get the information out for everyone.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is that time of year. Everybody's trying to get ready. It's topical now. Some of us have put away our fishing gear.
Well, let's just put it this way. Up here, it was 36 degrees this morning. Finally. Beautiful. And I think there was a couple little pockets there. We might have had a light frost.
What are you seeing out in the woods right now?
Ferns are dying. Leaves are turning. Some leaves are on the ground already in some of the woods. There's a good harvest of hazelnut this year. The bears are moving. Then I saw the northern lights a couple nights ago.
Did you really?
Yeah, I got a picture of it.
Oh, wow.
I have a client that's getting a dog for me, him and his wife's a veterinarian, and I told him, I said, now, they're over by Lac de Flambeau, and I said, if the northern lights are, I said, text me. I don't care what time of the night. So I get this text, northern lights are out. He typed, okay. So I'm running around outside trying to see it. And he had told me to take my phone and just where it's bright in the sky, even though you can't really define the colors really well, take the picture. And I did it, and it was really cool.
The phone picks up things in the spectrum that your naked eye cannot see.
Yep. For me, because I'm below tree level, and the lights were just barely above tree level to the north, it looks like you're seeing a city from about 40 miles out, but it's really wide. But it's not like it came all the way up into the sky straight above you. Right. It was more on the horizon. I even was here. It is almost 11 o'clock. I'm driving to the top of the hill to see if I can get a better view this way or that way. So I'm up there driving around in, of course, pajamas and everything with slippers. and it was just a tad bit windy, not too bad. So I park, turn off the lights. I've got the window down, and I'm trying to look, and a branch fell on the vehicle, scared the It's like, you weren't expecting, boom!
And listeners, this is great mental imagery. This is Ann in her pajamas out in the middle of an open field, watching the northern lights. You're out in the woods, okay.
I'm up in the woods in the vehicle. Yeah.
Oh, I thought you had found a clearing.
No, I told you I'm back in the woods. You haven't been up here. But I have a very small meadow. Smart ass.
Thank you. This is my job. Oh,
you're going to get demoted.
My wife and I were visiting my son near Menominee back in May, and I think a lot of our listeners will remember that if we did have a pretty significant instance of northern lights back then, and it was easy to see, and we had the stringy lights, and it was straight up in the air. It wasn't just on the horizon, but it didn't have any color. It was just white, at least where we were. But when you took your camera and took a picture, it was absolutely spectacular. It's been a number of years since I personally have seen northern lights with any color to the naked eye. We haven't seen it lately here anyway.
There's an app for it. You can put an app on your phone, but it tells you if there's a percentage chance. Lately, a lot of it's been over in the Scandinavian countries, or north of Quebec. But every once in a while, it drops down past Thunder Bay, down into our area here. And I went to pick up more quail on Saturday, and that guy showed me a friend of his, because he's from Iowa, was along the Mississippi, but on the Iowa side. Mm-hmm. And they caught the northern lights over the Mississippi, and it was just gorgeous.
Yeah.
So someday you'll see, you come in over down a big hill, and you're in the woods, because I'm over a mile back in. So you come down this big hill, and it was clear cut up along the top of the hill, and it looks way out over all the woods and everything. It's about 1,600 feet, which really isn't that high, but for our area, it is high. Mm-hmm. And then you come down into a low area, and then you wind around a little bit, and then it dead ends right at my property. I have a meadow, but it's so small as you drive in. I was thinking if I got up high enough, maybe I could see above the trees. Mm-hmm. But that didn't work either. Oh, but it was pretty cool. I mean, they happen to live on a lake, and it's facing just the most perfect direction to take pictures through the trees. So I sort of sat and I was thinking, now what lake could I go look at?
Well, you got a few of them up there.
Not close to me, though.
Find a southern shore, maybe a boat landing on a southern shore.
I've got one a mile from me, but there's really no boat landing or anything. It's surrounded with little cabins, and everything else is way too far away.
Yeah.
And so that's the nice part where I'm at. Most of all the summer people are to the east or the west of me, and I'm basically in a logging area.
You have a topic in mind tonight, and it's of great interest to me because it has to do with some of the areas that I hunt. And it stems from a question you got from a listener.
Yeah, I was on the phone with a gentleman that is from Lower Michigan area and hunts mainly Lower Michigan, occasionally goes up to the UP. And we got to talking about sand, because I know what that area is like. I spent my summers up in the Manistee National Forest, up there by Ecock, Baldwin, over by Custer, even over to Ludington in north, Casca area. I used to actually race sled dogs around there. And I used to race sled dogs up around Mackinac. And I grew up in the Lower Michigan, in New Buffalo, Michigan. I mean, that's not a grouse area, but that's where I grew up. And that's why I spent my time up closer to the Manistee and around that area of Manistee National Forest. So I'm very familiar with what he's talking about. And when I think back to the first time that I ever saw grouse, I was not out grouse hunting. I was 12 years old. I had a Savage 22 with a scope, and I was fox squirrel hunting. I was sitting and trying to call the squirrels. It was a big deal. It was the first time, and all this, do this, don't do this, do, check everything. Parents turn you loose, and off you go. And I remember seeing these birds coming through the ferns, and I was around some oak, not too far off with some jack pine, lots of ferns, typical Manistee National Forest stuff. And that's actually where I was at. These birds showed up. I didn't know what they were, and of course I'd been taught, if you don't know what it is, you don't shoot it. Well, I wanted to get a better view of it, and I'm like, okay, I'm not seeing any squirrels, so let's see what this is. So I stood up, and these birds went flying all over. And that was my first introduction to grouse. So I've tromped around a lot in the Manistee area, and I've been around the Kalkaska and even up by Pigeon River and over by Mayo and all through that area. I can relate to what he's talking about. It's sand. A lot of sand. And there's parts of Wisconsin that are like that. And so we got to talking about it, and he says, it's almost like a desert in a way. You've got this aspen stand, and you got all these big, tall ferns. And I said, yeah, it's sort of like pheasants in the field. If you get birds that are sort of jumpy, they just keep running under those ferns until they find an edge, and then they flush, or they feel surrounded or threatened or whatever. And he said, how would you break down one of those aspen areas. So we talked a little bit, and I thought more about it. And to me, when you're dealing with sand, you've got to find where the sand changes. Or, of course, in those areas, you hope maybe you have clumps of some type of shrub component or a cluster of tall pines or something like that. But if you're looking at just the cut and it's got aspen in there, it looks like to be pretty good density, and you're thinking about your edges, and he says sometimes the edges are up along a pine plantation. Well, it's basically a straight line.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you want the natural edges. Nature doesn't do straight lines unless they're tornadoes. That's or straight line winds. Let's put it this way: trees develop where they're at because of the soils. Now, when you get into soils, there's a whole bunch of information that's there, and it's like overload. It's sort of like my maps. Okay, we want to know where certain age cuts are, but then we want to know what's around each cut so we can think about the habitat that's around that cut, the time of day. What's the weather like? Is it windy? Is it going to give protection from the wind? Where's the escape route? Where do these birds want to go? Where are they going to feed? Blah, 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 all that stuff. And where am I going to park? And how would I handle it if someone has been in there? And all these different facets of it. And where's my lowland edge? Where's my upland edge? All of these things. And with aspen, basically, we don't think too much of it when you have more of a clay soil or sort of a mix soil. But when you get into sandy soil, it's sort of like, well, it's the same thing over and over with not a lot of breaks unless you have some little depressions that tend to hold a little bit moisture, and then you end up with a little bit of a shrub component. And I can remember being over by Eagle River, and I ran into cuts like that, and I'm like, got birds up. We found woodcock, but it was a different read for me compared to the Park Falls area and some of the other places like the Western UP. So there's things that you can think about. Now, let's just use the Western UP, and we can use part of Wisconsin that's sandy, and lower Michigan as well. So the national forest and some of these other state forests and also county forests here in Minnesota's got a lot of gravel. So those of you that have sand, like over Bemidji, this will apply. I think Bemidji's one big sandbox over there, but that's just me. It seems like every time I've been there, that's what I've been finding in around Cass and things like that. But there's a little more diversity because there's more between lowland and upland there. They've got a pretty nice mix. So anyways, back over to the sandboxes in Michigan and Wisconsin and the UP. Think about it this way. And I'm going to go back into my farming background. If you're farming sand, it's marginal habitat. You need irrigation in order to ensure a good crop. Then the next type of ground that you have, and the rent's going to be really cheap on the sand unless you have like a valley pivot for irrigation. So the next level of quality soil is the soil that's sort of a mixed sand and a little bit of gravel and a little bit of clay. Okay, we know we're going to get a crop off of it unless we have a big drought, but it'll have a little bit better yield, whereas the sand, we need water. No matter what, we're going to need water. And then the next soil types have some clay in it, or they got really nice fertile soil, and they can withstand a drought. They hold the nutrients better instead of allowing it to leach out like sand will. So think of it sort of like that. So when you're up in Wisconsin and other parts where there's sand, look at where the farming soil is in that area and take a look at it. I'm not talking blueberries and irrigation and things like that. like corn, soybeans, and things of that nature, or pasture land. It's a better quality soil. And up in the western UP, and there's places that would relate to this over in Marionette County and those areas, look at where your farming starts and where it stops. And some of the best cuts that I've ever dealt with up in the western UP haven't been too far from farm ground. And the soil just sort of continued that they were farming into the woods, the wooded areas. It was a mix of soil. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing when you think about some of the farming areas over to the west, or even for like the eastern part of Minnesota too. Some areas they're a mix. It's a mix of soil. And the heavier the soils are, the more compaction that you can get into the soils. And sand can also get compacted as well, which can be a problem. Where they run the skidder and maybe it's too wet and they just bang the heck out of the soil and compact it and nothing wants to grow there anymore. So when you look at soil texture, there's sandy soils, clay soils, and what's called a loamy soil. Now, sandy soils, we're going to talk potato chips.
I'm in favor of that.
Yeah, that actually sounds really good right now, potato chips. Except you'd hear me munching. So sandy soils are like the large pieces of potato chips. And they drain quickly. And how it's like when you have a bag of chips, you got the chips that are all whole, have not broken, or like Pringles. You start out with all the Pringles being just perfect, and then there's some that are cracked, and then way at the bottom, you got all the little pieces. So sandy soils are like the whole chips, and there's more air and everything around them. And as a result, because they let the moisture go through, and the soil particles are a lot larger, it drains quickly, and it basically will limit the availability of water for the trees. Mm-hmm. So you could have a great rain, and you're thinking, oh, this is going to help the crop? No. And the crop could be trees as well. So, and it just goes right down. It's like, okay, you've got 12 hours to get everything you need, and then it's gone. So that's what happens on your sandy soils. Your clay soils, well, they're a little bit smaller particles, and they retain the water better because they fit together better. So that's some of your cracked chips. This is a stupid analogy, but I'm trying. I'm also hungry now.
But the bottom line is it's the rate at which the water...
The sizes and how they fit together.
Okay. And the rate at which the water is absorbed.
Right. And so in loamy soils, you have a mix of the sand, the silt, and the clay. It's a combination, and it offers good water retention and drainage. So sandy says, here today, gone in a few hours, and water. Clay says, okay, I'll hold it. I can hold the water longer. And if the soils, though, become compacted, so if the soil becomes too compacted, then the roots don't receive the oxygen or the water because of the compaction of the soil. But it also can give plenty of water if it's not compacted, and it helps to basically produce good trees. But then there's loamy soils, and it's sort of like, well, we're a little bit of everything. And so it offers good water retention, really good drainage, and it typically supports a higher tree growth density because it helps to develop optimum root conditions for the roots to develop. So now you have what's broken down into high nutrient soils and low nutrient soils. Now, a high nutrient soil is a soil that's, let's put it this way, it's rich in essential nutrients. Like it would have phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium, and that helps the tree with growth, and it helps with density. And the trees in these areas typically grow faster, and you have a better density and growth rate. Low nutrient soils are poor soils. They may grow slow, sparse, have less density, which would be sparse, and they may not survive very long in some of these areas. They would quickly get taken over by trees that can deal with lower nutrients. Then you have the pH. You have acidic soils and you have alkaline soils. Acidic, those that are many that like acidic, a lot of them are like pines. Your pines like acidic soils. Alkaline soils are like a higher pH, and if it gets too high, it can limit the nutrient availability for the trees. So, and then there's soil depth. So I was thinking this gets too complicated, but deep soils, these are soils that allow for really good root systems, and they'll support a denser tree growth as the trees, they can get into more water. Shallow soils, obviously, the roots don't go down that far. Soil moisture, well-drained soils, poorly drained soils. That's pretty much self-explanatory. Okay. And compaction. With compacted soils, any area that has a lot of compaction, it'll restrict the root growth, reduces oxygen availability, and limit water infiltration.
What causes compaction? Is this a man-made thing, or does it happen naturally?
It can do both. So, man-made is where the processor goes out and cuts the trees to 30 foot to the right, 30 foot to the left, and then brings it in. And then as it goes forward, it takes and bucks everything up into pulp, and then it dries over the tops. That's one track going through there. Well, then the forwarder comes in behind there, and it basically starts grabbing all the pulp and putting it in the cradle to bring it back to where they deck it for the trucks. So there's one trail, and sometimes multiple trails in any logging sale, that will be like spokes on a wheel. And those spokes are how they go out and bring the wood back in. The log landing, because of course semis can't go out in the woods,
right,
where the logging equipment is. So it's the repetitiveness going over and over and over. And if that soil's wet, they're starting to sink down more and more and more. And natural compaction is areas like you have a field and you have water that pools in that area, and then it basically dries off. And if you went in there, it's that pressure of that water on top of there actually will cause compaction. The headlands are where the equipment in the farming fields, where they turn around, those are notorious areas for compaction. Because typically it won't be so much the headland at the other end of the field, not by the road, won't be too bad. But the headland, especially where the trucks come in, where the grain cart goes back and forth, that will be very compacted, and you have to subsoil it. And the subsoil shanks are like 3 to 4 feet, sometimes somewhere in there. 3. I mean, you're looking over a 250 horsepower, big 8-wheel tractor. Oh, they're fun.
and that's why even 20 years after a cut has been harvested, you can still see.
You'll see the log landing and the skid trails.
Yeah, you can still see the skid trails, and that's what we follow very often. Even though maybe it hasn't had anything run on it in a long time, we can see where they are.
Well, and it's not the end of the world by anything.
No,
I mean, the only thing that I hate in the log landing is the stump dumps. Okay. We call them stump dumps, but really, there used to be where you would have a slasher, and I would used to go sit with the slasher operators and teach them to cut for grade for veneer and locate birdseye on second shift. And so when you would bring the whole tree in, except for the top, we would then buck it down according, okay, here, this part's veneer, this part's going to be a number 1, and maybe we'll get a lower grade here, and then that's pulp down at the end, something like that. And those areas, so you buck off the area that really flared, they cut it, and you got that big huge flare. Sometimes, depending on if there was rot, you would swing it around and look at it. Okay, it's rot. I think if we go up 5 feet, we can get rid of that 5-foot section and cut that off, and then you throw it off. I mean, here's got this 5-foot section of this big huge yellow birch. You just throw it like a toy and bounces off a big pile of other sections. So we call them stump dumps. And there was one place they're notorious too when you're in the woods. If you see an area that's a little bit elevated and it's got a lot of raspberries, that could be all stump dump and trash. So keep your dogs out of that.
Okay.
I mean, it'll break a leg.
That's helpful. That is. Hey, you talked about farmland a little while ago, and can we back up? And I want to ask a question about that. When we are in a section of our state with sandy soil, and there are some ongoing farms that have been there for a while, they've made a go of it. You made it sound like that might be an indicator that that little area has slightly better soil.
Yep.
And we should look for cuts nearby. Fair statement?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good statement. Okay. You take note of that soil.
Okay.
Because there could be areas that can have that soil,
mm-hmm.
but it may not even be close to farm field, but it was always national forest.
Sure.
Or it was always county land.
Okay.
So look at that as an example of the farm fields and what's getting farmed.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you find cuts along through there, look at the soil. Take time to look at the soil. And we know a lot of times, like in those sandy areas, the tops, if there's a little bit of hilly, it's sort of like non-productive a lot of times. And it's really thin and sparse cover there.
Right.
And so getting back to what he was asking about is look where there's a transition in that edge that goes down to that lowland area. Those areas can provide transition in soil type. So your low edge is really, really important in sandy soil. If you can find a low edge, or find where you find some quality trees starting to grow or butt up to it. And when I say quality, I mean some of those manatees in those areas over there, and I mean
mm-hmm.
there's so much oak. But there can also be a transition in density, especially if there was some logging done in the past and you got a transition between the aspen and then an oak stand. There's a buffer. It's where the two soils come together, but it's like this soil to the right going down toward the lowland is aspen, and it's like the one to the left is the oak and maybe some white pine, and
mm-hmm.
and it's like, well, these trees are going to grow better on that soil, and these trees are going to go better in this soil, and this soil is transitioning. There's this transition going on there. So those are just some things to look at. I'm not an expert at it. I mean, my part comes from farming.
Mm-hmm.
But pure sandy soils, the challenges that they have for aspen trees, poor nutrient retention. Sandy soils have the larger particles and low surface area, which means they don't hold anything in it. We talked about the water, but that's the same thing with the nutrients. They drain rapid. Root stability. And what's interesting, think about this. Sandy soils tend to heat up and cool down more rapidly than a soil with a higher organic content. So it stresses the aspen roots in certain areas when there's extreme temperature fluctuations. And the water and the fertilizer, it needs more water, and the fertilizer tends to leach. So what leaf litter that may be on the top where they're getting the nutrients, because when you look at sandy soil, there's usually a darker top in some areas, and then it's just really narrow, and then boom, you're right into sand. That's another indicator. How deep is that? You know what I'm talking about, Steve?
I think so. Say that in a different way.
Okay, so the leaf litter.
Yeah.
How you've got, like, oh, I might find a few worms, and then it's just down to sand.
Yeah.
If you were to dig down through it. Well, that can vary in depth at top part.
Right.
It's like the icing. That icing's
mm-hmm.
important on a cake. It's
sure.
also that top part's very important. So that's where you get the more nutrients. And it's the breakdown of slash, of leaves, and such like that help build up the nutrients. And, the decay process. Think about it. In a maple stand, it's right at the top, and it just keeps going.
Are you saying we'll have less of that in sandy soil?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you have sandy soil, as it gets closer to a wet area, that darkness there will get a little bit deeper.
Okay.
That top, or the icing, or whatever you want to call it. I'm still on the food kick.
I see that, yes. But you've gone from potato chips to cake.
And it's all in the sweets and snack department. Oh.
So this explains something a little bit, because I think everybody's figured this out by now, but Ann and I live in different parts of the state of Wisconsin, okay? And where I am, tag alders and lowlands play a different role. Whereas whenever I want to talk about tag alders with Ann, she says, I stay out of that stuff. Okay, I don't even want to go in there. Where I am, it's a real key. Hunt in a 3 or 4 county area that is very sandy.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. How thick is your tag alders? Can you walk through them?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, it's just...
I'm at, it's typically no.
Okay. Yeah,
it's rare if you can walk through them here. And that's what makes it interesting.
Yeah, and it's often not as thick as what you're describing where we are.
Right.
It's not fun to walk through them, but if your dog's on point down in there, if it happens to be a dry enough year that you can get in there, yes, if you absolutely have to, you can usually get in.
Mm-hmm.
We hunt those edges here a great deal.
Oh, yeah, and we hunt the edges, but it's just some of them that I get around are, you'll break a leg in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how am I going to get from here to there? And it's just like weaving your fingers together and having everything pointing upward. And it's like, how am I going to get around this? It's really nasty. Mm-hmm. But there's areas out east where the tag alders are tall. Especially in some of those areas that periodically flood along riverbanks and down through those areas.
Okay.
I mean, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and there's other areas where they're super thick. Like with the aspen trees, they need loamy soils. They prefer loamy soils, which is a nice balance of a mix of sand, silt, and clay. And then they like a soil pH that's, well, actually to be accurate, 5.5 to 7.5. And they like somewhere between there. So they're not too fussy. It's just they have their niche. And you get some of this aspen that's on an extreme. It's growing like in sand. But you also will see what happens is that I look at a 9 to 16-year-old range. Roughly. Usually the decay is pretty well. You can start at around 9 years old, walk through an area, and it's pretty good. And this is what Gordon Gillian was looking for as well. And at 16, it's really starting to majorly thin. And the next timber types are starting to become a little more dominant. But with sand, your window is actually narrower. You don't have all those years. It's more condensed into a smaller time frame. So you never know when I map, I look at it and I'll say, I know there's sand in that area, but I can see the bottom side of this cut is going toward the lowland area, which means it's going to pick up better soil. And that's how I look at things. And so it's no different than anywhere that you hunt. You need to look at what's around you, besides the trees, besides the dog. That's how you need to sort of check the soil out. I mean, one of the things, too, that I've talked about in the past is, if you want to know if a cut is ready, it's getting to that, like, for instance, it'd be interesting, and you'll have to try this, Steve. At about 10 to 12 years of age, but usually closer to 12 where I'm at. If I go up to the stump that they cut and that helped produce the next generation of aspen after the harvest, and I kick that stump, I know the outer bark will fall off. And usually that's just about between that 10 and 12. It's going through some really nice stages. Really is an asset to the birds, especially like early to mid-season. But it might be different in your area. When does the bark come off the stump? You just go in there and you kick it, and it poof, falls off. Okay. So next time, go kick a stump.
Go kick a stump. All right. I've been told to do worse. So, but in a drier area like sandy soil, are you saying the rate of decay is going to be a little slower?
It's not the rate of decay.
Okay.
It could be slower. It depends on your thickness of your canopy and how is it holding in the moisture.
Okay.
And you heard me talk about the hothouse effect?
Right.
When it's super thick because the humidity is higher.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it. For instance, if you grow soybeans on gravel, they're less likely to get mold in August. But if you grow soybeans on really rich soil, really beautiful soil, you actually, back when I was farming, you had a pretty good chance of soybeans getting mold. And like for us, we would mix like 3 different types of soybeans at different maturity days just to try to help prevent mold, because then it wouldn't affect the whole entire crop. And so when you look at this, aspen would be quaking aspen, big tooth aspen, and white birch are all what's considered a pioneer species. They're the first to come into certain areas and really establish themselves. And then after a certain point in time, other trees are the next generation of what comes in. And they thin out, they fall over, and then other trees start in. So they're all pretty much the same. The paper birch, the big tooth aspen, and also the quaking aspen. So it's interesting to think about it this way. But one of the things is that on clay soil, aspen has problems with compaction, nutrient availability if it's compacted, which then affects. I can think of one cut in particular, especially it was older imagery, but it was down by the Jump River, and there's a lot of clay down there. And in certain areas, there's also gravel. But it was down by Jump River, and this was back maybe 25 years ago. I can't believe how the time's gone by, but it was old black and white imagery, and it was compacted like everything the way they logged it, because I think it just got wet on them, and they said, well, heck, we're just going to take it all out. And they had trails all over the place. And when you looked at that imagery 10 years later, it was the canopy where they hadn't run over it, the canopy was normal, and where they had run over it, it was sparse, and it was not as high. You could see the difference in height in the canopies, depending on whether it was compacted or it wasn't compacted. And the whole cut was a disaster, because it was like good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. It was chopped up like a spoke wheel throughout, and thank God it was only probably 30 acres, but it was really a mess. And it's no different in farming. You compact the soil, you will have less yield. No different in forestry. You compact the soil, you won't have the density.
Okay. Can we talk about shrub component for just a second?
Mm-hmm.
In the clay soil near you and into many areas in Minnesota, hazelbrush is a really, really key piece to the shrub component. It's something that you look for.
Mm-hmm. It's not about clay.
Okay.
It's about gravel.
Okay. All right. Because we don't have as much hazelbrush here in the eastern part of the state.
You don't have much gravel either.
Okay.
They got a lot of gravel over there in Minnesota. And hazelbrush likes gravel. Think about where old riverbeds used to be.
Okay, sure.
And I can someday show you that.
All right.
When we think of transitional habitat, loamy soils are often considered the best for establishing transitional habitat. It's a balanced texture, it's good drainage and moisture retention, high fertility, and it supports a diverse vegetation. It can sustain plants and timber, whatever you want to say, from both type of sort of like ecosystems. It's a biodiversity deal. It's adaptable. It's stable. And so that's what you get in a loamy soil. And then there's also a sandy loam soil. It has a high sand content with a silt and clay. That's sort of that area where I'm talking about where it starts to change. Remember when I was getting on about cakes and frosting?
Yes.
So it's warm, it's well aerated, but it's easy. It allows water and air to penetrate, and it benefits plant growth. And then there's a silt loam soil. And so, I mean, this just keeps going on and on and on about this and this and this. But think of it this way. When you start looking at an area that has predominantly sand, and you walk through it, and you walk the edges, or you cast back and forth, look for where your changes are. Look for your lower edge. Look at what's growing on that upper edge and the density between where the two meet. And look for any pockets of lowland areas that might retain additional moisture but also contain a shrub component. And every area is different of what the shrub component will be. We have winterberry shows up in our area. We also have the hazelbrush, which is more in a little bit of a different area. There's different shrubs in different areas, and I can't speak for all the other areas because, I mean, it's like where you are at in Marionette. I can't speak really for Marionette. I know a little bit, and I've been through there, but have I run around Marionette County hunting? No. I've basically hunted the western UP. I've been up along the North Shore, been into Canada, and definitely Wisconsin, and I've been in other places in Canada. So, and I know some about out in Bingham, Maine, and some about New Hampshire and Vermont, because I've been through those areas. I don't know as much about those, definitely, as what I know what's in my own backyard in the states that adjoin me where I have been.
Sure.
So,
okay.
I don't know. There is an awful lot of breakdown. And it's not that you have to be an expert on soils. What you need to be is an expert at identifying the changes of what is growing where. That's where you need to be the expert.
In my case, where I hunt, I really need to key in on where I'll find moisture, an accumulation of moisture for some reason.
It's extremely important in your area, more so.
More so. Got it. Okay. And we have a couple other questions that came through. One is about bird numbers, and one's a shotgunning question, which I'm anxious to talk about. But we had something from VA Hunter, and he asked, what are Wisconsin bird numbers like from your perspective? And I like the way you phrased that, because you've got a unique perspective for your part of the state.
I've seen multiple broods. I do think there's going to be areas that it's going to be spotty. And not that there aren't going to be birds there. There'll be birds. It's just your numbers are going to fluctuate. So it's like you can make an opinion, but you can't make that opinion on one area. Different parts of every state have more moisture or less moisture, or just starting a drought, or out of a drought, or never had a drought, or have been dealing with issues. So it all depends on where you hunt, because what I talk about, it may only be good for 3 or 4 counties, and what someone else talks about. But I mean, I've talked to quite a few foresters, and they are seeing birds, and I can same thing for up in other areas that I've talked to in the Midwest. It hasn't just been Wisconsin.
Okay. And we had a question from Tyler that kind of ties into that just a little bit. And he's asking whether he had that wonderful warm winter where the birds came through it in really nice shape. But he was asking whether the spring rains, and he particularly asks about the June rains, whether that had a negative impact on brood survival.
It depends on where those rains were.
Okay.
And yeah, it could have. I have seen 2 different age classes of chicks. So that means there was some born early and some born late. So I do know that, and I've talked to a couple foresters, and they've said the same thing. So yeah, I think there's been a little bit of effect to it. And what the other part is if you go into an area and you're starting to see 8 go up in a covey, you had a good area. That area really had the perfect weather and everything else. If you go to an area and you only see 3 or 4, both of those situations are weather related, but it can also be a predator issue too. So, and it could be also, if the birds are holding, they haven't been messed with by predators or by people working their dogs. And if the birds are not holding in an area and just running like everything, it could be a combination of August training and predators.
Okay.
Right there. Or weather. When there's fewer birds, they run quicker. They're more quick to run.
Because something pressured them. It could be predators, it could be people, but something pressured them.
Something educated them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We had a shotgun question.
Mm-hmm.
So Tom is asking, is a 28 gauge shotgun good for grouse hunting?
I love it. I mean, I like using a 28, but it also, it fits with my style of running dogs. I mean, I'll use a 20 gauge as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it fits to where I see the guys where the dogs run bigger, they're using, 20s and even sometimes 12s. And I'm not a 12 gauge shotgun fan personally. Because a lot of times you get to take those Hail Mary shots and you see the leg drop, but you never get the bird because it flew so far into the swamp that you're never going to get it. So that's just me. Mm-hmm. But each his own. But I like the 28. Goes for how I like to work dogs. It's light. I love light guns. You can get 20 gauges that are light as well. And everyone has their own, what fits them the best, so to speak. But yeah, 28 gauge is fine. And a lot of it, too, relates to how the dog works.
Right. And an awful lot of people carry 28s in the woods. I think that as the season progressed, the woods are more open. The birds are a little more educated. The shots are a little bit longer. If you're going to stay with a 28, you might want to tighten your chokes just a tiny bit. Or you may want to go to a 7/8 ounce load, which is on the high side for a 28. They do make them, though. And if you're a loader, if you're a hand loader, there's plenty of data out there for 7/8 ounce. Yeah, there's not a thing wrong with the 28, especially if you shoot it well. They're easy to carry. They come up nice. And I personally carry a 20, but I hand load. Okay, so early season, I'm walking around with 3/4 ounce loads in my 20 gauge, which is essentially really about the same payload as what you're going to get in your 28 gauge. So yeah, there's not a thing wrong with it. Again, I personally, my own opinion is late season, you might want to rethink that just a little bit and either go to your 20, or a lot of people go to 1 ounce loads in 20 gauge late season, or just tighten the choke a bit. So either you're going to hit them hard or you're going to miss them entirely. So it's just one man's opinion.
Well, we all have that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It's fun. There's no right or wrong answer when you're talking about shotguns. You're not a fan of 12 gauge. My father-in-law shot nothing but 12 gauge. But again, he loaded. And he loaded 3/4 ounce 12 gauge loads. And he just said, he used to have a saying, and he said, beware the man that shoots one gun because he probably shoots it very well. And that's what he did. That's all he ever carried. He had an old SKB that he got when he got back from Vietnam. And he seamlessly went from 3/4 ounce loads to 1 ounce loads. And for pheasants, he loaded 1 3/8. And he always shot the same gun. So you can do that with the 12, but you're right. Sometimes with the 12, if you're shooting heavier loads, you have that tendency to try to take that long shot. Yep.
Especially if you haven't brought a bird down yet.
Yes, that's true. The frustration shot.
Yeah.
And this is fabulous. We've got these questions. And if people have more questions, how should they ask?
Mobilehuntingmaps.com. Go to the contact part of the website, and there's a form that you can fill out or post it on Facebook. Either one will work. And we'll try to, hopefully we don't miss anything. And if I do miss something, then just say, hey, you missed me. I'm glad to be able to help. Hopefully I didn't get too far into potato chips and frosting, and at least I didn't bring up cookies.
It all sunk in the sand. It's okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
So, good.
All right. Is there anything else you want to cover this evening?
No, I think that does it.
All right. Well, and thank you. And as always, remember Scout and Hunt Maps. Offline all the time, always there for you, with or without cell service, with the information that you need to be successful. And also, as always, remember to hunt the habitat. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Okay, you too. Take care.
See ya.